The vibration of my phone against my nightstand rattled me awake, a dull buzzing that wouldn't stop no matter how many times I ignored it. I groaned, rubbing my eyes as I blindly reached for it. The clock read 7:42 a.m., way too early for a Sunday, and yet my phone was practically exploding with notifications. Missed calls. Dozens of messages. Most of them were from numbers I barely even recognized. What the hell was going on? I scrolled through the unread texts, my pulse quickening. Jake, dude, WTF did you do? Ryan, bro, tell me it's not true. Anna, I don't even know what to say. Seriously? Unknown number. Congrats, Dad. My heart slammed against my ribs. What the actual hell? I sat up, now fully awake, my fingers shaking as I scrolled through my notifications. Then I saw it, the post on the school's anonymous gossip page, sitting there like a time bomb waiting to detonate. Last night's party was insane. Can't believe Opie and Emily snuck upstairs and now she's pregnant. Guess someone's getting a shotgun wedding soon? For a full 10 seconds, I just stared at the words. My mind refused to process them, like my brain had short-circuited. My throat went dry. I could already feel the heat creeping up my neck, the slow, creeping sense of dread settling in my stomach. I hadn't gone upstairs at all. Emily and I had barely even left the basement. We played some video games, had a few drinks, and left before midnight. That was it. So who the hell thought this was funny? The buzzing started up again. Another call. This time, from Mom. I barely had time to brace myself before the door to my room slammed open so violently that the handle cracked against the wall. My mother stood there, her face white with rage, her chest rising and falling with shallow, erratic breaths. Behind her, my father loomed in the doorway, arms crossed tightly, his jaw set in stone. Sit down. Her voice was ice, cold, sharp, and lethal. My skin prickled. I'd seen my mom angry before, but never like this. Not with this level of disgust. Mom, sit down. I sank back onto the bed automatically, my phone still clenched in my hand. My pulse was racing, hammering in my ears. Don't even try to lie, my father said, his voice like gravel. We saw the post. For a second, all I could do was blink. I swallowed hard. You guys seriously believe that? I tried to laugh, but it came out weak, dry, like I had swallowed a mouthful of sand. It's a joke. A stupid, bullshit rumor. I didn't. Emily's parents called us. My mom's voice cracked, and she took a sharp breath, like she was barely holding herself together. Her mother was sobbing over the phone. They are devastated. Do you understand me? Devastated. You threw away your entire future. You threw away her future. I didn't. I shook my head, the panic rising in my throat like bile. Mom, listen to me. It's not true. Emily and I never. Enough. My father's voice was cold, final. He pinched the bridge of his nose like he had a headache, exhaling through clenched teeth. You expect us to believe that someone just made this up? That half the school is talking about this for nothing? Yes. My voice cracked. My breath was coming in short, uneven gasps. Dad, I swear to God, it's not true. Who the hell even starts rumors like this? Who, indeed? My mother snapped, her arms crossing over her chest. You were at the party. You and Emily were drinking. How do we know you even remember what happened? Something inside me snapped. I shot up from the bed, fists clenched at my sides, my chest heaving. Because I was there, Mom. I know exactly where I was. You think I wouldn't remember getting Emily freaking pregnant? Watch your tone, my father warned, his eyes darkening. I let out a bitter, humorless laugh, running a hand through my hair. This is insane. You really think I'd lie about something like this? That I'd ruin my entire life. Emily's life, for what, fun? Emily's parents seemed to believe it. My mother shot back. Why would they be calling us in tears if this was just some harmless rumor? Because they're just as paranoid as you. I threw my arms out, exasperated. God, Mom, do you even hear yourself? You're ready to throw me under the bus because of some random post online? It's not just some post, my father said sharply. It's your actions. It's your recklessness. You've been dating Emily for months. If this is true, then you've just made both of your lives harder." I was shaking. My blood was boiling. "It's not true." A sudden knock at the front door made my mother flinch so hard that she nearly jumped. My father exhaled sharply, glancing toward the hallway. "That'll be Emily's father." A wave of cold, suffocating terror washed over me. I looked between them, heart hammering against my ribs. "Wait." My father turned back to me, his face grim, disappointed. "You better think long and hard about what you're going to say, because this is your mess to clean up." And with that, he walked away, leaving me frozen in place, my breath shallow, my vision blurring at the edges. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But as I heard the front door creak open, followed by the sharp, angry voice of Emily's father echoing through the house, I knew one thing for sure. My life, as I knew it, was over. The front door barely had time to close before the shouting started. Emily's father's voice thundered through the house, deep and raw, the kind of rage that made my stomach knot before I even heard the words. My mother's voice was higher, strained, the edge of panic lacing her every syllable. My father's tone was sharper than usual, the forced calm he used when he was trying to maintain control, but it was useless because Emily's father wasn't here to be reasoned with. The argument was a storm already raging, and I knew standing frozen in my room wouldn't stop it from reaching me. My legs felt heavy as I forced myself down the hallway, my palms slick with sweat, my throat tight with the kind of fear I didn't know how to swallow. My feet barely touched the last step before Emily's father's glare found me, his face flushed with anger, his breath uneven like he had barely contained himself from launching into a physical confrontation. "You!" he barked, his finger jabbing in my direction, as if the mere sight of me was enough to confirm everything he had already decided was true. "You had the audacity to show up at my house, sit at my dinner table, and act like a decent boyfriend to my daughter while you were ruining her life behind my back?" My mother's hands clasped together, the tension making her fingers turn white as she looked at me like she was hoping I'd drop to my knees and confess. My father had his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his silence was permission for Emily's father to go on. The weight of their combined judgment made it hard to breathe, like they had already sealed my fate, like the truth wasn't something that mattered anymore. "I didn't do anything," I said, my voice coming out more defensive than I intended, but it didn't matter because Emily's father wasn't here to listen, he was here to punish. "You didn't do anything?" His laugh was humorless, loud, a sharp contrast to the way his eyes darkened further. "You think this is some misunderstanding? You think Emily would lie? That her mother would be sobbing over the phone for nothing? That I'd be standing in your house, demanding answers if I didn't already know the truth?" I didn't know what was worse, the blind certainty in his voice or the way my parents didn't even blink, like his outrage was further proof that I had to be guilty. I could feel my own pulse in my skull, pounding so hard that it blurred my thoughts, made my words feel heavier than they should have. "Emily knows this isn't true," I said, but it wasn't a statement, it was a desperate plea, something to convince myself that this wasn't as bad as it was. She wouldn't say this. She wouldn't let people believe this. Emily's father scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief as he turned toward my parents. "You really raised a little bastard who can't even take responsibility for his own mistakes?" My mother let out a sharp gasp, her body tensing like the insult had physically hit her, but still, she didn't defend me. My father, however, finally unfolded his arms, his face hardening as he took a step forward, his presence suddenly heavier. "There's no need for that," he said, his voice controlled, even, but the underlying warning was clear. Emily's father didn't care. "No need." His voice rose, his fury bubbling over again. "No need? My daughter is upstairs right now, locked in her room, sobbing so hard that she can't breathe because she's afraid of how her own life is about to change. And your son stands here, lying to our faces like we're a bunch of idiots? You want to talk to me about what's unnecessary?" My stomach twisted violently, the edges of my vision blurring again as the pressure in the room suffocated me. I needed Emily to call me. I needed her to send a text, something, anything, to end this nightmare before it spiraled even further into something I couldn't pull myself out of. I reached for my phone, but before I could even check if she had messaged me, Emily's father was already shoving a piece of paper toward my chest, his hand shaking with frustration as he practically forced me to take it. "You think this is some dumb rumor?" he growled. "You think this is just some sick joke? Then explain the damn test." My fingers fumbled to unfold the paper, my heartbeat so loud in my ears that I almost couldn't register what I was seeing. My vision swam over the lines of text, but the words that mattered jumped out at me in sharp, unrelenting clarity. Pregnancy confirmation. Estimated conception date. Emily Carter. Everything inside me crashed into itself at once, my thoughts colliding so fast that nothing made sense, like I had stepped into an entirely different reality, one where logic had collapsed in on itself. My throat locked, my breath caught somewhere between disbelief and something too close to fear. My grip on the paper tightened as I reread the words, my mind scrambling for something, anything, that would make this make sense. "This isn't mine," I finally managed to choke out, but the words felt thin, weak, hollow. "It's not mine." My mother inhaled sharply, but I couldn't look at her. My father exhaled, but he didn't argue. Emily's father, however, stared at me like I had just spit in his face. "Then who the hell's is it?" he snapped. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I had no answer. I had no proof. I had nothing. The silence that followed my last words was suffocating. Emily's father looked at me like he was ready to throw me through the nearest wall, his hands clenched at his sides, his whole body radiating barely contained fury. My mother turned away, bringing a trembling hand to her mouth as if she couldn't even bear to look at me, while my father stood rigid, his face unreadable, his disappointment so thick in the air that I could feel it pressing against my skin. My heartbeat pounded in my skull, my hands shaking as I stared down at the paper in my grip, the confirmation of something impossible staring right back at me. It wasn't mine. It couldn't be mine. But with the way everyone was looking at me, waiting for some kind of explanation I didn't have, I realized that the truth didn't matter anymore. They had already decided what they wanted to believe. "You're telling me this isn't yours," Emily's father said, his voice dangerously quiet now, like he was forcing himself not to explode. "Then whose is it?" I had nothing. My mind was racing, trying to find any possible way to prove that this was some massive misunderstanding, but I didn't even know where to start. Emily and I had been together for months, yes, but we had never. There was no way. I needed to talk to her. I needed to hear it from her own mouth that this wasn't real, that this wasn't happening, that she wasn't standing by while her father accused me of something that wasn't true. My fingers fumbled for my phone, my breath shallow as I pulled up our texts. No messages. Nothing. My stomach twisted painfully as I forced myself to call her, pressing the phone against my ear, praying that she would pick up, that she would tell me this was a mistake, that she would make it stop. But the phone rang once, then twice, then went straight to voicemail. "Emily, it's me," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. "Call me back. Please. I need to talk to you." I lowered the phone slowly, my throat tight, my vision blurring at the edges as I forced myself to look back up. My father let out a long, sharp exhale, rubbing a hand over his face like he was trying to gather whatever patience he had left. My mother still wouldn't look at me. Emily's father took a step forward, his presence towering, his breathing heavy and uneven. "I want you to come over to our house," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Tonight, we are going to sit down, and Emily is going to tell you exactly what she told us. And when she does, you're going to take responsibility, whether you like it or not." There was nothing I could say. I had no proof, no alibi, nothing but my own word against Emily's, and right now, no one seemed willing to believe mine. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded, my jaw clenching so hard it hurt. Emily's father turned without another word, pushing past my father and slamming the door behind him, leaving a thick, unbearable tension hanging in the air. The moment he was gone, my mother turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "How could you?" The words sliced straight through me, sharp and cold. I opened my mouth, desperate to defend myself, but the look in her eyes made me stop. It wasn't anger. It was worse. It was disappointment. I didn't, I whispered back, but she just shook her head, turning away again. My father let out a sharp breath and finally spoke, his voice controlled but firm. You're going, he said, and it wasn't a suggestion. You're going to listen to whatever Emily has to say. And if she says this child is yours, you are going to be a man about it. I had no choice. I barely made it through the rest of the day. My mind was a whirlwind of anxiety, confusion, and something dangerously close to dread. I kept checking my phone, hoping for Emily's name to pop up, but the screen remained blank. I tried calling her again, but every attempt went straight to voicemail. The hours dragged on, slow and heavy, until finally, it was time to go. By the time I pulled up in front of Emily's house, my hands were slick with sweat, my stomach a tangled knot. The house was dark except for the glow of the living room window. I forced myself to step out of the car, my heartbeat hammering in my ears as I made my way up the steps. The door opened before I even knocked, and Emily's father stood there, his glare still as harsh as it had been hours ago. "Come in," he said gruffly, stepping aside. The house was eerily quiet. Emily's mother sat on the couch, her face red and puffy like she had spent the entire day crying. Emily sat beside her, curled up with her knees to her chest, her eyes fixed on the floor. My breath caught in my throat. She looked exhausted, broken, but she wouldn't even look at me. "Sit," her father ordered. I sat. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Emily's father crossed his arms and nodded toward his daughter. "Tell him," he said. Emily inhaled sharply, her fingers twisting together in her lap, and for the first time since I had walked in, she finally lifted her gaze to meet mine. And then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, she spoke. "It's not yours." The world tilted. I blinked. The words didn't make sense at first. I thought I had misheard. I thought maybe she had said something else, something I wasn't able to process. But the look in her eyes, the way her shoulders curled in on themselves, the way her mother let out a broken sigh beside her, it all confirmed that I had heard her correctly. Emily's father flinched, his entire body stiffening. "What?" Emily swallowed hard, her hands tightening into fists. "It's not his," she repeated, her voice shaking now. "I never said it was. I never told anyone it was his. Someone just assumed, and I didn't correct them." My entire body felt like it had been set on fire. I shot up from the couch, my breath coming fast and unsteady, my fists clenched so tight that my nails dug into my palms. "Are you kidding me?" My voice was sharp, raw, an explosion of everything I had been holding in for the past 14 hours. "You let me take the fall for this? You let your dad come to my house, scream at me, humiliate me in front of my parents, and you just—" "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, but I barely heard her over the roaring in my ears. Her father turned to her now, his face unreadable, his hands shaking at his sides. "You lied to us?" Emily let out a shaky breath, looking down at the floor again. "I didn't lie," she mumbled. I didn't say anything." Her father stepped back like she had struck him, his entire body suddenly deflating. I barely even registered the way her mother started crying again. My own breath was shaky as I ran a hand through my hair, trying to ground myself, trying to keep myself from completely losing it. I had spent the entire day being accused, humiliated, and torn apart over something that wasn't even mine to carry. And worst of all, Emily had let it happen. Emily's father stood there, his face drained of color, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides like he was trying to hold himself together, like he couldn't believe that after all his shouting, all his accusations, after barging into my house and making my parents think I had ruined my own future, it had all been for nothing. His breathing was uneven, his jaw tightening as he turned to his daughter, his voice coming out slow and controlled, but I could hear the fury behind it, the barely restrained explosion waiting to happen. "You sat there and let everyone believe it was his?" His words were measured, but his body betrayed him, his hands shaking, his nostrils flaring, his entire frame stiff with disbelief. Emily kept her head down, her fingers gripping the fabric of her sweater so tightly that her knuckles turned white, Her shoulders curled inward like she was bracing for impact. But she didn't speak, didn't try to defend herself, didn't even try to explain. I could feel my own heartbeat slamming against my ribs, the adrenaline still coursing through me, the anger and betrayal making it impossible to think straight, to process the fact that I had spent the last 14 hours drowning in panic for absolutely no reason. My parents had looked at me like I was some irresponsible screw-up. My father had already decided that my life was over. My mother had barely been able to look at me, and all because Emily hadn't bothered to say two simple words. Not him. My breath came out sharp as I turned to her, my fists clenched so tightly at my sides that my nails dug into my skin. My voice coming out raw and shaking with everything I was barely holding back. Why? It was the only thing I could manage, the only thing I could force out past the tightness in my throat, because I genuinely couldn't understand, couldn't wrap my head around the fact that someone I had trusted, someone I had been with for months, had let my entire world burn around me without even trying to stop it. Emily swallowed, finally looking up at me, her eyes red-rimmed. Her lips pressed together like she was trying to find the right words, like anything she could say would somehow make this okay. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she said, her voice small. Like that changed anything. Like that erased the fact that I had spent the whole day being treated like a criminal. I let out a sharp laugh, one that had no humor in it, one that was just pure disbelief because there was nothing else I could do, because if I didn't laugh, I might actually lose it. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" I repeated, my voice rising, my hands shaking with the effort it took not to completely explode. "So what? You just forgot how to talk? You forgot how to say no? It's not his? That's all you had to do, Emily. One sentence, and none of this would have happened." Emily flinched, her fingers twisting together as she tried to steady her voice, but it was cracking now, like the weight of everything was finally hitting her, like she was only just now realizing how badly she had screwed this up. "I didn't think it would get this bad," she admitted, and I could see her father's jaw clench even tighter at her words, his hands now trembling with the sheer effort it was taking him not to lose control. "You didn't think?" I snapped, my voice sharp, cutting, because I was done, because I had spent all day being blamed for something that had absolutely nothing to do with me, and now I was supposed to just accept that she didn't think? "Do you have any idea what today was like for me? Do you have any idea what you put me through? I had to sit there and watch my parents look at me like I was some pathetic failure, like I had destroyed my entire life, while your dad was in my house screaming at me like I had ruined yours, and you didn't think?" Her mother covered her face with her hands, shaking her head like she couldn't believe what she was hearing, like she was only just now realizing that all of this chaos had been over something that could have been avoided if Emily had just told the truth. Her father took a sharp breath, his voice now dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that made the air in the room feel heavy, suffocating. "Who is it?" He didn't even try to soften the words, didn't try to make it sound like anything other than what it was, an accusation. Emily's fingers curled into her sweater again, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard, her gaze flickering away, her whole body shrinking under the weight of the question. "It doesn't matter," she mumbled, but the words only made the silence stretch even thicker, her father's face darkening with something that almost looked like disgust. "It sure as hell matters to me," he shot back, his voice cracking through the silence like a gunshot, his patience finally snapping, his hands shaking so hard now that he had to press them against his thighs to keep them still. "You let me storm into this boy's house. You let me humiliate him in front of his own damn parents. You let everyone think he was some reckless little punk who couldn't keep it in his pants, and now you want to act like none of it matters?" Emily's breath hitched, her body curling in even further like she wanted to disappear into the couch, like she wanted the ground to just swallow her whole. But still, she didn't answer, didn't give a name, didn't say anything to even begin to justify what she had done. My pulse was still racing, my hands still shaking, my stomach twisting with everything that had happened. But now, as I looked at her, at the way she couldn't even lift her head, I realized something else. She was scared. Not just guilty, scared. For the first time that day, I stopped thinking about myself. I stopped thinking about my parents, about the humiliation, about the betrayal. I just stared at her, really looked at her. and it clicked in a way that made my stomach drop all over again. She was hiding something, something bigger than just a mistake, something bigger than a lie that had spiraled out of control. I took a breath, forcing myself to steady my voice, to push down the anger long enough to focus. "Emily," I said, and her gaze flickered up to me, wide and panicked, like she knew what I was about to ask. "Who is it?" Her father was still waiting, her mother was still crying. My own hands were still clenched at my sides, but for a long moment, she didn't answer, didn't move, didn't even breathe. And then, finally, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, she whispered something that made my blood run cold. "My sister's boyfriend." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything else that had been said that night, heavier than every accusation, every argument, every moment of humiliation I had endured. The room, already thick with tension, seemed to shrink around us, the silence stretching unbearably as everyone tried to process what had just come out of Emily's mouth. Her mother let out a sharp, ragged inhale, a sound that was barely stifled by the hands she still had clamped over her face. Her father didn't move, didn't even blink, but something in his expression cracked, his body going unnervingly still. His eyes locked onto Emily in a way that made my stomach twist. I exhaled slowly, my mind working to catch up, to piece together what she had just admitted, to make sense of it in a way that didn't feel as disgusting as it did. My voice, when I finally found it, was hoarse, unsteady, like I wasn't entirely sure I had actually heard her right. "Your sister's boyfriend?" I said, and even as I repeated it, even as I forced the words out, I could barely believe them. Emily flinched, like hearing it spoken aloud made it worse, like she had been hoping that saying it in a whisper would somehow make it less real. Her fingers twisted together in her lap, her shoulders curling in even tighter as she nodded once, quick and small, like she was bracing for impact. Her father took a slow, measured breath, his nostrils flaring slightly, his face locked in a tight, unreadable mask. "You better start explaining," he said, and his voice was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made my skin prickle with unease. Emily licked her lips, her throat bobbing as she struggled to find the words, her voice barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. "It was only once," she mumbled, her eyes fixed on the floor. He said it didn't mean anything. He said it was a mistake, and I didn't think, Her mother let out a broken sound, her shoulders shaking violently now, her hands trembling where they were pressed against her face. "Oh, God," she breathed, and her voice was so full of pain that it made my own chest ache. Her father, however, remained completely still, his fingers twitching at his sides, his jaw tightening with something so intense that I could feel it from where I was sitting. "Which one?" he asked, his voice so low I almost didn't hear it. Emily's head snapped up, panic flashing across her face. "Dad." "Which one?" he repeated, louder this time, his entire body radiating fury now, his breathing heavier, his hands balling into fists. "You are going to tell me exactly who, and you are going to do it right now." I could barely breathe, barely process what was happening, but even through my own shock, I could see that Emily was terrified. Not just guilty, not just ashamed, but terrified. Her eyes darted toward her mother, like she was looking for some kind of help, some kind of escape, but her mother was just shaking her head, murmuring something under her breath that I couldn't make out. Emily's voice cracked, her hands gripping the edge of the couch now, like she needed to ground herself. "It's Nathan." Everything after that happened too fast. Her father's entire body tensed, his face darkening with something primal, something dangerous, something that made the air in the room feel suffocating. Emily's mother let out a choked sob, shaking her head violently, her whole body trembling like she was going to collapse in on herself. Emily shrank back, her breath hitching as she curled further into the couch, like she knew exactly what was coming. And me? I just sat there, frozen, watching it unfold with a sick, twisting feeling in my stomach that I couldn't get rid of. Nathan, her sister's boyfriend. I barely knew the guy, had only seen him a handful of times, at school events or in passing, had never even spoken to him beyond a casual nod or a short greeting. But I knew enough to know that he had been with Emily's sister for years, that they had been together longer than Emily and I had, that he had been practically family to them. And now, Emily was sitting here, confessing that he was the father of her child, that she had slept with him, that she had let me take the fall for it because she had been too afraid to tell the truth. Emily's father didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his jaw so tight I thought it might break, his hands shaking at his sides as if he was physically restraining himself from tearing the entire house apart. When he finally did speak, his voice was low, controlled in a way that was almost more terrifying than if he had started shouting. "Get up." Emily's head jerked up, her eyes widening. "Dad, get up." She moved slowly, hesitantly, her hands gripping the armrest of the couch as she pushed herself to her feet. Her father didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her beyond the way his body tensed when she moved. His attention was on his wife now, his voice still quiet but carrying the weight of something unshakable. "Call her." Emily's mother let out a broken sob, shaking her head. "Please don't. Call her." The room was suffocating, the air thick with something dangerous, something that felt like it could explode at any moment. Emily's mother's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, her breath uneven as she scrolled through her contacts, her fingers trembling so hard that she almost dropped it. She pressed it to her ear, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Kara, honey, she choked on her own words, exhaling sharply before trying again. "Come home. Now." Emily's face was pale, her breathing shallow, her fingers twisting together so tightly that her knuckles were turning white. I didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do, didn't even know if there was anything I could do. My head was still spinning, my pulse still racing, my mind still trying to catch up with what was happening. I had come here expecting to fight for the truth, to prove that I wasn't the father, to clear my name. But now, sitting here, watching this family fall apart in front of me, I felt like an intruder, like I was witnessing something I was never supposed to see. Emily's father inhaled deeply, exhaling slowly through his nose before he turned back to his daughter, his voice quieter now, but still laced with something sharp, something final. "You are going to tell your sister the truth," he said, and there was no room for argument, no room for hesitation. "And then, you are going to pack your things, because you are not staying in this house." Emily let out a sharp inhale, her entire body tensing, her eyes wide with something close to panic. "Dad, please." "You made your choice," he said, and his voice was cold now, detached, like he had already decided that she was no longer his responsibility. "Now you live with it." Her mother let out another broken sob, but Emily just stood there, frozen, silent, her entire world crashing down around her in the same way mine had earlier. But this time, there was no one to blame but herself. Emily's father stared at her, his breathing heavy, his body tense like he was holding back everything he wanted to say. Her mother sat motionless, her hands trembling, her face twisted in silent devastation. The weight of her confession had crushed whatever chance she had at fixing this. "You let me go to his house," her father said, his voice quieter now but sharper than before. "You let me humiliate myself, humiliate him, let everyone believe a lie. And for what?" Emily's lips parted, but no words came. "Pack your things," he said. "You're leaving this night." Her mother closed her eyes, pressing a shaking hand to her forehead. Emily looked at her, searching for something, support, hesitation, anything, but found nothing. She turned toward me next, her expression unreadable, but I was already stepping back. I had nothing left to say. Emily swallowed hard, then turned and walked down the hall without another word. Her father exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples before glancing at me. "I'll call your parents. They deserve to hear the truth." I nodded, gripping the door handle. "I'm sorry," he added, but it didn't matter. I stepped outside, letting the door close behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to.